Hello and welcome everyone to the February 23rd edition of GAIN, the Generative AI News Rundown. It's a weekly live show from VoiceBot.ai and Synthesia, and I'm VoiceBot head writer Eric Hal Schwartz. My usual co-host, VoiceBot founder Brett Kinsella, is traveling this week, so we have a special guest host filling in, someone well known in the conversational AI community and who's been very active in the GAIN comments as well, Mikhail Stanislawik, the founder of Utter.one and HearMe.ai. Hi, Mikhail. Oh, and if you are joining us live, please feel free to share any comments or questions you might have on the side there, and we will be responding to them throughout the show. Mikhail, please take a second and introduce yourself to people who might not know you.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me. Yes, I do get excited about generative AI recently,
Yes.
which shows a lot in the comments and LinkedIn especially.
Yeah, well, there's certainly not a shortage of exciting topics to discuss. So I guess we'll just jump right in with some of the unusual news this week of Microsoft putting restrictions and then lifting them again on the Bing AI chatbot, which is the OpenAI derived conversational or generative conversational chatbot that they recently introduced. There was almost immediately some stories of very unusual conversations, and if you listen to our episode last week, you can hear some details about that. But in response, Microsoft put some limits on how long the conversations could be and how many you could have a day. But just a few days later, they loosened those restrictions a bit, and it just seems like they're still trying to figure out the right approach to have and the right level of control to put on these SAI. And so, Mikhail, what do you think? What is Microsoft trying to do here?
No, I think that it was a response to all the publicity that's gone live after all the interesting conversations that Bing started having with the customers, and was a justified one, but it also drew attention, and I think that also encouraged people to maybe try it a little bit more. So relaxing those restrictions, I think it's trying to find the right balance and also possibly tell people that there's nothing to hide, and that this is just a normal process of trying to balance what you're getting.
Yeah, it was interesting seeing Microsoft's comments on how they just weren't quite ready yet and how they wanted to bring back these features later on, which is very much something I associate with startups rather than one of the biggest tech companies in the world. But it does definitely show the interest in Bing's chat is definitely not slowing down anytime soon. I do wonder, do you think Microsoft can fulfill these promises? Can it really bring back the longer chats without falling into the same trap?
Well, I think so, and I certainly do hope so. I mean, they are really the first ones to put it alongside the search engine, which is quite significant, and I think it is important for people, especially from the perspective of building new habits around researching information, finding information, and search in general.
I think it's definitely it's an indicator of where there's still a lot to be done, but Microsoft is taking the lead on this. It seems like they wanted, and they are the first really big company to have something like this, and we've seen Google and others trying to catch up, but I guess the traps in the future, Microsoft's going to be the one to trip over them and have to come up with solutions even before anyone else.
Well, I guess there's a certain danger, to being one of the first ones, right? And that's the trying to almost find the right path, right? And I think I generally do like experimentation, and this is showing a bit of a startup approach to this problem, which I really like, and it's always very welcome in my head from big companies like Microsoft.
Yes, and of course, Microsoft using OpenAI and their attempts to try to balance the power of the models with the potential for accidental or deliberate misuse. This is something that OpenAI itself recently was facing, and they have their own plans, they said, to offer more customization to basically just how it's trained so that people can feel more comfortable with their own iteration. do you think these seem related? Do you think it's just going to be how generative AI functions in the future? Everyone's going to have their own special model.
Well, this is actually where I'm into minds at the moment, because I'm not necessarily sure if I see an everyday person trying to find their or to build their own model, right? I certainly see the future where if that is truly allowed, then there are going to be different versions almost of those AI chats that are more reflective of the views of the people who are training them or fine-tuning them or generally trying to teach them new stuff. I think again it's an interesting and a good way to experiment and to find the right balance, because even with the best intentions, there's always room for bias with training and then human contributors to training.
Yeah, and it is interesting because when OpenAI mentioned their plans for customization, part of their announcement was discussing how they do their training, the guidelines they follow, what they ask their human reviewers to look at. And at first glance seemed fairly non-controversial, fairly straightforward. It almost sort of begs the question of why there are these sort of bias issues. And when it comes to vast amounts of data, with these databases online, I guess my question on this kind of thing is always, how much can you filter without losing the very thing that makes it valuable to begin with?
Well, exactly, and I think that's also part of the reason why they're trying to explore this path of allowing people to generally create their own versions, right? And I think time will tell, and we'll see based on the use cases and based on what people will really come up with, and whether this is going to be a change for the good or whether this is going to be end up being a wrong turn.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to some of the, not just an individual user, but on the enterprise level, the business level. I mean, we've seen so often in tech where there may be a consumer application, but it's on the enterprise side that there's actually money to be made. And of course, Microsoft having invested billions in OpenAI, and OpenAI spending quite a lot of money for a good reason, but spending quite a lot of money on research and development, there's this need for them to find ways to monetize, and they do have their the ChatGPT Pro, but I don't know if they are quite at the scale where $20 a month from people is going to make a difference, which happily brings us to our next story I want to discuss, which is very new, of OpenAI sort of quietly shopping around an option for exactly that kind of giant company that needs more control over its generative AI. I guess I'm curious, this Foundry program, it seems like exactly where this kind of technology usually starts rather than where it goes. It's more normally often feels like it starts in the enterprise, moves to the consumer, but is this just a consumer tool moving up to enterprise, or what do you think about this idea of the OpenAI Foundry?
Well, I generally think that this is also the right path, right? This is something that even with the availability of the APIs from OpenAI, I think a lot of people, especially considering more professional workloads and use cases, were actually lacking. It's a dedicated instance, an instance where you can pay and reserve your compute units, right? And I think this is exactly what we're seeing with Foundry, and this is going to enable the truly professional workloads. And it also shows a few interesting points, like the turbo word being used next to the GTP 3.5, right?
Yes. Yeah. It was very interesting looking through the product paper, not only for what it says it will offer in terms of, the dedicated space and potentially more control over monitoring and fine tuning, which certainly makes sense. But even the hints at much more powerful models to come, whether that's GPT-4 or something else, really suggests that there is a deeper plan, or at least a goal by OpenAI for making generative AI and making its models at least as much a part of a business as any other standard software product that every company in the world uses now. That seems like a big step for them.
It does, and it certainly feels like a good step to take before GPT-4 actually hits the market.
I guess what the question everyone, and certainly every business, will be asking is, can they solve those problems using these more advanced efforts like dedicated space, like better fine-tuning skills? Is this going to relieve any concern of a very valuable brand that people who their customers or their employees using the technology won't face weird or just inaccurate information coming from the generative AI? I mean, is this going to hit the levels of precision and accuracy that a big business needs?
I don't think that this particular step is going to address that point, but I think it will definitely improve stability, right? And this is what I see behind Foundry, and both from the perspective of being able to fine tune and use your own data when it comes to building on top of GPT, but also having a reliable service where you can attach an SLA. Right, and you're no longer one of the couple of hundred or a few thousand people trying to use that commonly accessible API. I think it's the right step for the enterprise use cases for sure.
Yeah, and I do wonder, there was a story we discussed this a little bit ago that now seems to have a lot more evidence, or a lot more behind it now. The issue of a big company, Bain and Capital, announcing a partnership with OpenAI to connect its clients with OpenAI's generative AI potential. And the way it was described, it was obviously somewhat vague, as these announcements usually are. But I do wonder, is this exactly what they're talking about? Is this going to be Bain having its own dedicated compute space where it can produce products or services using generative AI that meet its standards, meet its client standards?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in my head, it's nothing but connected, especially with Coca-Cola, a huge brand being mentioned in that announcement. I mean, for these sort of use cases, they will absolutely need dedicated compute and the highest stability that they can get out of their infrastructure. But what I also think it's quite interesting about that announcement is that brands are finally getting ready to experiment openly with large language models and these types of workflows.
Yeah, and Brett has joined us in the comments, and he asked a good question. If OpenAI is putting together its own list of enterprise services, whether it's what they're doing with Bain or the Foundry project, is that going to be stepping on the toes of their arrangement with Microsoft of the Azure OpenAI services that Microsoft supports and has integrated with its own products?
Well, I mean, I know we've only seen a glimpse, right, of what Foundry might become, but there's it nowhere says that it won't use Azure. The way I look at it, it might as well be connected, and it might as well be actually leveraging from the partnership and from the Azure compute capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, if I recall correctly, Microsoft's deal with OpenAI involved some level of exclusivity for its models, although obviously not in every instance. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all these other services. But this does very much feel like something that Microsoft is going to bring to the table, which I guess would address what you were discussing before about the stability issue. If people, if businesses are looking at working with OpenAI, but then they see the foundational level is Microsoft and Azure, they're probably going to feel a lot more comfortable with it.
I would be very surprised if Azure is not in the picture of Foundry in one shape or form.
It would feel somewhat it would feel like a bit of a waste for OpenAI to invest the resources that Microsoft gave it as an investment to reproduce what Microsoft already has, I think.
Absolutely.
But actually, that relates to another big story that really addresses the core of why generative AI is expensive, or why it's powerful, the compute space, the processing power, and again, the issue of stability, which is an Azure rival, Amazon Web Services, which Amazon's been sort of quiet on the generative AI front, at least in the way that Microsoft and Google have been very upfront and very on the top of the page of a lot of stories. But yes, so AWS is working, or has at least made a deal with a different service. And Mikhail, maybe you can talk a little about this. Why is Hugging Face working with AWS? Is this going to be, a secret rival that nobody's aware of until 2 years from now?
Well, I guess we're going to see what future brings, but I think it makes a lot of sense for Hugging Face to partner with Amazon, and it makes a lot of sense for Amazon to partner with Hugging Face, especially that Hugging Face comes with their own models and a lot of community alongside with it, and a lot of researchers and people that are actively working on those.
Yeah, I should say Hugging Face is known for its own generative AI models, including Bloom, which is an open source model, and it has that sort of very dedicated open source developer community that OpenAI actually was first building toward when it initially launched. But yeah, it does seem like this gives Hugging Face and its models a really big jolt of power to complete bigger projects or to serve companies that it couldn't do before. I mean, is this the quiet launch of a rivalry, or do you think is it going to be something that we see happening soon, where companies are choosing between AWS and Azure as much as they're choosing between OpenAI and Hugging Face?
I think there are two important points here, right? The first one is that this partnership will enable developers, people who are already familiar with AWS, or companies who already have their infrastructure located in the AWS, to much more easily use and incorporate large language models into their product, services, and workflows. But the other aspect of why it's important in my head is the search for cost optimization, right? And this is important, and this is what we're now seeing, is that those large language models are not cheap to run, especially if you're thinking scale, right? So any improvements in terms of cost, in terms of being able to run a different kind of a large language model, for example, maybe an open source one, and trying to find optimizations there, is going to be hugely important to a lot of the businesses.
Yes, and as we saw recently, even though Google has its own generative AI projects, Bard and so on, even they have made a deal for offering their own cloud computing capacity to a different large language model developer, Anthropic. And I think, I agree with what you said. It makes a lot of sense. It's going to be where the next big fight is. But in terms of the cost and trying to make up for it, we talked a bit about how this could be the monetization solution. But OpenAI, of course, is not limiting itself to just ChatGPT Pro, and this they and Microsoft have been working with a different Microsoft brand, GitHub, on Copilot, the coding service, which taking with a grain of salt the fact that the surveys are coming from GitHub, programmers seem to really love, and they recently had a pretty significant update that they seem to think will really make Copilot a universally beloved programming tool. I mean, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Is that where we're going to see a lot more demand for generative AI?
Yes, this is one of the use cases that I'm genuinely excited about, because it brings like immediate real value to people, in this case developers who are using it. And if you are a developer, and if you've ever been a developer, then you will understand that context switching is a huge cost, right?
Sure.
If you need to find a solution, I mean, there are a lot of the websites that you can go to, like Stack Overflow, ask questions, but it's associated with context switching. And this is what the Copilot is taking away. I mean, you're staying in your context. You're not switching to a different place to find your solution. And also, in for the most part, you're a person that has knowledge about the domain that you're generating in this particular case. So you're supervising the output to a much higher degree than, for example, somebody who's using ChatGPT to generate, marketing copy, for example, or
Sure.
something else.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me, the idea of prompt engineering and coding, of course, having a deep connection. I was, again, taking a grain of salt, but just kind of amazed at what GitHub claims Copilot can do, that it can write nearly half the code and nearly 2/3 of the code if it's in Java. I don't buy into the idea that generative AI is going to be putting tons of people out of a job or anything, but it does make me wonder if the job of coder will involve a change of, or additional skill sets, or new training. Is this going to be, how you identify yourself as a programmer, going to be about how well you understand generative AI and how well you use it, as well as all the other skills you already need?
That's true, but I don't think that developers in particular are in any danger. I mean, yes, you can generate code, and you will be able to generate better code with time, obviously. But especially for complex scenarios, you will still require human oversight. And I think right now the play here is not really about replacing people. I think it's about increasing productivity and increasing the amount of value that you can get from a developer. A developer that isn't using generative AI versus a developer that is using generative AI, and their output and their contribution to the actual feature set that you can release.
And I do wonder also, one of the things that I've charted, and excuse me, one of the things I've always found interesting is how these sorts of coding aids filter down to the non-coding person. There's always a big interest in the low code, no code space, and we've seen experiments with using conversational language, of using natural language to create a website, to create an entire virtual world, and now that seems to be moving into the generative AI space. There's one of the great example being Roblox, which is both a very popular game and a very popular metaverse space, a digital world. And now, like so many other companies, they've announced their own involvement with generative AI in their own projects. But unlike some of those other ones, it seems like they're really angling at combining what they already offer their users with an entirely new opportunity to create and explore and build within a digital world. And that seems to involve bridging that gap between the coder who writes everything themselves, the AI assistant who helps fill in the blanks, and the designer who understands how to use an art program but isn't necessarily looking at the code behind it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is this a big deal the way obviously they want it to seem, or is this just another announcement?
No. Again, this is super. I mean, from a perspective of making a coder become a kind of a designer, right? But maybe not in its entirety, but give them the freedom to be able to experiment, give their imagination the possibility to actually do something without having, again, to hire a designer, to talk to a designer. I mean, developers are not necessarily social creatures a lot of the time, right? And also from the other perspective, right, it can allow a designer to become coder. Maybe, again, not a coder in the fullest extent of the word, but somebody who can not only design, but then can give life to their designs. And what is particularly important and interesting about this, that this is happening in an environment where you have a lot of kids, where you have a lot of kids experimenting. So Roblox is going to be important from the perspective of actually broadening this concept of generative AI into the minds of the youth. And I think that's what's quite significant here.
Yeah, I do imagine that there's all those stories, of course, of the kids who really enjoyed writing text adventure games in the 70s and 80s when they're experimenting with very basic coding, who then go on to produce the 3D realistic worlds for both games and other purposes. And when you mentioned in terms of bringing it to life, I do find it it's exciting. Not just the idea that you could use natural language to create an object, but that by describing the object, the model would understand what it means in terms of how it would interact with the environment. Where if you describe a red ball, it's not just that it's going to look like a red ball, but that it will roll on the ground and so on. And I never know how immediate these things are going to be, but it does often feel like there's a huge sea change coming that we are just seeing like the very beginning of the wave forming right now. But I'm very excited to see what happens. I'm always felt I'm too old for Roblox, but this may actually get me to start playing with it.
Yeah, well, it's definitely good to try those new things and those new environments, because you never know, and you never know what sort of door within your imagination or your creative process that this can open. And this has, for me, been one of the most interesting things, is that one thing leads to another, right? You open one door, you cross one boundary with generative AI. Now being able to visualize your imagination, for example, using your natural language, and it opens new possibilities. I think this is what's really truly beautiful about generative AI these days.
Yeah, the exciting possibilities, and of course any potential problems ahead as Microsoft is learning. But as we said at the beginning, there's a lot going on every week. It's impossible to keep up with it in terms of discussing every single, even the biggest stories. It feels like you can barely hit all of them. But thank you so much, Mikhail, for joining me this week on Gain. And before we go, I just wanted to ask if you want to share how people can find you, or anything that you're working on that you hope people will want to check out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the best place to find me these days is LinkedIn. You can find me at xmstan, or by my name, which is a bit more difficult to pronounce for most people. And one of the exciting things that I'm working on, and this is based off a post that I actually posted after the last week's Gain, is trying to create a space for people to actually freely discuss these sort of things, because I get excited a lot about generative AI, and I know other people are getting excited as well. So, follow me, and more details will come very shortly.
I've been Eric Schwartz from VoiceBot.ai. Be sure to check out some of the things that